Hi, I'm Megan. Welcome to today's live reading of Practically Pagan by Maria DeBlassie, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Join me for Chapter 1. Chapter 1. What is everyday magic? Over the years, I've written a lot about everyday magic, a term I use to describe the mysticism inherent in our everyday-to-day lives. In practice, this means cultivating joy and consciously letting go of negative patterns. It means listening to yourself and your needs, and it means having long conversations with the stars and giving yourself permission to dream deeply with wild abandon, both at night when you sleep and during the day when you can turn your daydreams into seeds for future happiness. So, where does the magic come in? When we think of magic, we think of wizards and witches with wands and cauldrons and grimoires. It's true, I call myself a bruja, and more specifically, a kitchen witch. It's also true that I have a cauldron, two in fact, only I call them cast iron pots. I even have a few spell books. They are a collection of family recipes written in a handmade book, the catch-all binders where I save my favorite recipes for roasted chicken or stew, and the well-used copies of my beloved collection of cookbooks. And that's just it. These simple, mundane things are actually full of magic. We just aren't always aware of it. Too often, we look for the sublime in things outside ourselves and neglect the beauty of what's right in front of us. Think about it. How many times have you fantasized about throwing caution to the wind and moving to some far-off paradise in the hopes that it will bring back your inner joy? How many times have you longed for an enchanted life only to dismiss the little things that make your life wonderful? It's time to tune into these little delights and daily insights that are waiting at the bottom of a teacup or in the upturned face of a hollyhock. They are there, waiting to be noticed, waiting to share their magic if you only open yourself to the universe. My journey into magic. I started my journey into everyday magic at a time when I had forgotten what it was like to wake up full of excitement to start the day. I was burnt out. Graduate school can do that to you, as can juggling 2 or 3 part-time jobs at a time. Don't get me wrong, I was glad for those experiences and proud of earning my doctorate. But once I got stable work, I knew I didn't just have to survive anymore. I could live. I could have time for myself, unfettered by looming deadlines and exhaustion. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I had weekends, real weekends, where I could do human being things and sleep in. I knew where my next paycheck was coming from. That was the starting point for me. I'd achieved relative financial and professional stability. Never underestimate the power of a steady paying job. Now I could focus on my internal life, nourish my soul, find my magic again. I needed to remember who I was outside of external accomplishments and hard work, both of which I love, if I'm completely honest. But a woman, especially a wild brown woman, can't survive on external achievements alone. I needed to return to a deeper way of living, one that didn't have me skating across the surface of life in a desperate attempt to please those who held my future in their hands. I could slow down and relish each moment as it unfolded. So there I was, ready to dive headfirst into my latest adventure of self-healing and self-discovery, a time I'd been fantasizing about for years. So much so that it was the only thing that got me through my work sometimes. There was only one problem. No sooner had I embraced my desire to reawaken my inner magic than I'd been forced to confront one shocking secret. I was addicted to busy. I literally couldn't slow down. I was used to long days and quick meals. Even shoulder pain from punching over my desk felt like a normal part of my life, as did the inevitable griping over the proverbial water cooler at the office. I couldn't believe it. Me, the woman who even at her most stressed out and busy, still made time to clean her apartment and do the dishes after every meal. The woman who hated negative talk and gossiping. The woman who insisted on taking Sundays off and going on long walks through the city because maintaining even a sliver of unstructured time just for myself was essential to my happiness and my magic. Without knowing it, I'd succumb to superficial living by not caring for my body and feeding needless negativity, among other things. Clearly, finding my way back to myself was going to be harder than I thought. I knew my magic was still there. It'd gotten me this far after all. I wasn't so far down the road to mundane living that I couldn't acknowledge my current success was due to the personal magic I'd cultivated all these years. It wasn't gone, just dormant, tired, in need of tending. But I also knew that if I didn't start tending it more seriously, it would be gone. That's what long-term burnout and living inauthentically does. It depletes your magic. This was when I first learned how hard it could be to live more consciously. I was no stranger to hard work, but I found that I had to get used to the idea of making space for personal wellness, seeing it as something that was just as valuable, if not more so, than my external accomplishments. In fact, all my external accomplishments, I now realize, came from a foundation of stability and self-care. Still, it took time to unlearn the guilt in the sense that I was being lazy. I felt whenever I took time to rest or nurture myself. But more on that in the next chapter. It was even harder to let go of concrete or visible measures of growth. As a brown woman in academia, so much of my survival depended on proving my worth over and over again through concrete achievements. In fact, I realized that graduate school had been a series of check marks for each task completed. Now, in my developing Bruja lifestyle, I had no tangible way of understanding my progress. I only had how I felt, which made things difficult. I'd spent the greater part of the last few years second-guessing every feeling, every instinct I'd had because of imposter syndrome. The silencing I endured as a woman of color in the white space of higher education kept me from trusting my intuition. So I started blogging on the magic of everyday life. I needed a way to understand what made me happy and what didn't. I needed to find my voice outside of my professional life. My writing has always been a source of healing and power for me, so it made sense that it would play an integral part in my journey back to my magic. I made a list of the things that blocked my energy. Too many people, not enough quiet time, for example, and worked on eliminating them from my life. These things were actively making me feel tired, anxious, and heavy. Okay, so I knew what wasn't good for me. Then I went about exploring what was. Each day, once I committed to that first year of reclaiming my magic, I wrote a blog post, taking no more than 20 minutes to do so, reflecting on the things that made me happy. I filled my blog with recipes, pictures, and creative musings on simple pleasures and the difficulties of trying to carve out a more magical life for yourself in a world that would prefer you to be numb inside and therefore easier to manage. Even talking about the darker aspects of magic, what I call everyday gothic, or living in a world that doesn't always value divine feminine energy, was cathartic. Even posting imperfect work was delightful for me. Perfection had become an ugly cage that held me back from taking risks, both on the page and in my life. I reclaimed my power with each word I wrote. I also learned how to get more comfortable articulating my mestiza roots and exploring my culture on my own terms rather than performing what mainstream white culture or other mestiza voices wanted my relationships to my culture to look like. I found others like me, people looking to reconnect with their natural mysticism and eschew the mainstream culture. Mixed race people quietly exploring what that meant to them. Recovering academics rediscovering the joys of creating. It was a relief to know that I wasn't the only one struggling to return to my true self. These people made me feel brave. Gradually, one post at a time, one day at a time, I was able to return to myself. I started small, cultivating an awareness of what gave me energy and what took it. Gradually, I came to understand that each thing I had to let go of was intrinsically tied to three basic things I had to unlearn in order to create space for magic: toxic patriarchy, performative extroversion, and mindless busy. Things I've had to unlearn. They seem so obvious now, but at the time I was so entrenched in these social constructs that I couldn't seem to find my way outside them. Once I began to heal my relationship with myself, it was as if I had woken up from a deep sleep. I could see these constricting ideologies like strands in a spider's web trying to pin me down. Toxic patriarchy. This is pretty much what it sounds like. Any system or belief that mindlessly promotes toxic masculinity as the ultimate form of power. There is such a thing, after all, as healthy masculinity. Just look at the Emperor card in the tarot, or a good father. Each of them is a benevolent masculine force caring for those he loves. Toxic patriarchy, on the other hand, is all about control over women's bodies, minds, and actions, not to mention anything that smacks of traditionally feminine traits, like one's emotional or internal lives. In fact, it has an unhealthy control over men's bodies, minds, and actions too, and it does so to people who do not conform to the gender binary. This is an ideology, in short, that is harmful to people of all genders because it privileges extroversion, aggression, and force over more subtle forms of expression or empowerment. I consider myself to be very in tune with my feminine side, having grown up in a home that valued talking about our emotions, listening to our instincts, and finding wisdom in the dreams we'd had the night before. That said, I found that when I was in the wider world, I'd begin to shut down that part of myself in order to survive. As a minority in higher education, an institution that at its worst is designed to reinforce and privilege white, able-bodied, heteronormative, cisgender patriarchy, I found myself continually apologizing for my presence there. Yes, I had allies, many of them who are still my good friends today, but that didn't change the fact that a 20-something mestiza studying 18th century British literature, of all things, I was an anomaly in the ivory tower. In the worst cases, anything I did that was vaguely emotional was written off as female hysteria by some of my closest advisors. If I was too friendly and I was labeled as an overly sexual woman of color. Things like close-knit family relationships were viewed as hindrances to furthering yourself in your profession rather than an important part of your life. Unstructured or personal time was for lazy people, and forget taking care of yourself. Shoulder and neck pain from poring over books and back pain from sitting too long were like badges of honor for hardworking scholars. This was all the dark side of this experience, of course, and certainly plenty of good came from that too. However, these toxic patriarchal messages were subtle and persistent, and because I was so unconscious of them, I began to feel guilty when I took time for myself. I became numb to cope with the stress of feeling like I couldn't express my emotions without it devaluing my work. All in all, I look back on that time and I realize I could have been an emotional, intuitive, self-care focused woman if only I had recognized the destructive ideologies of work and consciously countered them as I do now. But my imposter syndrome was so strong, as was the power of the presumed incompetence, a term that means that anyone who isn't a white man in academia is assumed to be automatically incompetent. As a result, the more I felt called out for presumed incompetence or seemingly unprofessional behavior, the more I embodied those perceptions of myself. Once I allowed myself to feel what I needed to feel, however, and acknowledged how divorced I'd become from the divine feminine within me, I began to heal. Better still, I found friends across gender expressions who experienced the same thing and took comfort in knowing that they too were committed to reclaiming their inner magic. Individually, we learned that the destructive power of toxic patriarchy was in disconnecting us from ourselves and from forming healthy relationships with each other. Together, we could resist toxic patriarchy and promote a healthier, more holistic form of education and relational living.